It was a cold Tuesday morning when Jonathan stepped into his boss's office for what he thought would be a routine meeting. But as the door clicked shut behind him, Derek Stone's smirk sent a chill down his spine. "I think it's time we part ways," Derek said, tossing a termination letter across the desk with a practiced ease. Jonathan froze, the words hanging in the air like a weight. This wasn't just about a job. Derek's cold, calculated dismissal felt personal, like a well-orchestrated plan to strip him of everything he'd worked for. But as Jonathan stood there, trying to process the betrayal, something shifted inside him. The rage bubbled up, but it wasn't just anger, it was a promise. Derek had made a dangerous mistake, and Jonathan would make sure he paid for it. The city was waking up slowly, as it always did after a storm, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the promise of a new day. But for Jonathan Evans, today would not be just another ordinary day. The office building that towered above him seemed to mirror the uncertainty in his chest, its glass facade reflecting the world outside, but offering no glimpse of what awaited him inside. Jonathan stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the cold, impersonal structure that housed Mercer Industries, where he had spent the last 5 years of his life trying to prove himself, trying to be enough. The streets were still wet from last night's downpour, the occasional car splashing through puddles, as though they were in a hurry to escape something. But Jonathan wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere today. He had an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing sensation that wouldn't go away. He had woken up with it, and it only deepened as he walked the familiar route to work. His wife, Jasmine, had noticed it too. The worry lines on her face had been harder to ignore this morning, and she had kissed him goodbye with more force than usual, as though she knew something he didn't. Inside the building, the hum of fluorescent lights and the clicking of keyboards seemed like the soundtrack of a normal day. But to Jonathan, it all felt wrong. His feet felt heavier than usual as he made his way to the elevator. Each step echoed in his ears, louder than the silence that surrounded him. The other employees passed him by, their faces focused on their own lives, their own routines. Some greeted him with a smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach their eyes. The kind of smile that spoke volumes about the subtle prejudices buried beneath the polished surfaces of corporate life. Jonathan Evans was a black man, a father of 2 young children, a man who had worked tirelessly to provide for his family and build a future for them, brick by brick, day by day. He was a man who believed in fairness, in loyalty, in working hard to earn what you deserve. But in the world of Mercer Industries, that wasn't always enough. As he entered the elevator, he found himself standing next to Derek Stone, the manager of his department. Derek, tall and imposing, was the kind of man who wore his authority like a shield. He had a reputation at Mercer One that didn't need to be spoken out loud. Everyone knew. The whispers, the sideways glances, the way certain people avoided him in the hallways, was all part of the unspoken rule of the office. Derek Stone was not a man who was known for his kindness, his fairness, or his understanding. He was known for being difficult, demanding, and, to put it bluntly, for his racist tendencies. Jonathan had learned to tolerate Derek. He had learned to smile when Derek made a pointed comment about his clothes or the way he spoke, to bite his tongue when Derek made offhand remarks that felt like little digs, jabs meant to remind him of his place. But today, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Derek's presence beside him in the elevator was suffocating, like the air had suddenly become too thick to breathe. "Morning, Jonathan," Derek said with a half-hearted smile, his tone flat, as if it required little effort to greet the man who was, in his eyes, nothing more than another cog in the machine. Jonathan nodded, but his mouth felt dry, the usual pleasantries caught in his throat. "Morning, Derek," he replied, keeping his voice even. The elevator doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and they both stepped out onto the floor where Jonathan had spent the last 5 years of his life. He passed by the same cubicles, the same offices, the same faces he had grown accustomed to over the years. But today, the place felt alien to him. The air was thick with the anticipation of something unspoken, something that hung in the balance but had yet to be revealed. It was a momentary thing, a feeling that washed over him like a tide he couldn't escape. He thought he might be imagining it, that perhaps his nerves were playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew something was wrong, and he would find out exactly what it was before the day was through. As he sat down at his desk, the familiar clatter of keyboards and ringing phones did little to calm his growing sense of unease. He glanced at the clock, 9 o'clock. The meeting with Derek was scheduled for 10 o'clock. And though he tried to focus on his work, his mind kept drifting back to that nagging feeling. He had heard the rumors. He had felt the coldness in Derek's eyes during their brief interactions, the way Derek would purposefully exclude him from team lunches or give him tasks that were beneath his skill set. He had learned to ignore it, to power through it, to keep his head down and do his job. But not today. Today, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. And as he opened his email and saw a new message from Derek, the subject line clear and direct, meeting request, Jonathan Evans, Jonathan's heart sank. This was it. He had been expecting this moment for a long time, but the reality of it felt heavier than anything he could have anticipated. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his breath catching in his chest. What now? He didn't know it yet, but in just 1 hour, his life would change in ways he couldn't imagine. The minutes felt like hours as Jonathan sat at his desk, staring at the clock. His fingers drummed against the edge of the desk, a rhythmic beat that did little to ease his rising anxiety. The email from Derek Stone burned in his mind, the subject line so simple yet ominous. Meeting request, Jonathan Evans. It felt like a prelude to something he had feared for months, something he had tried to ignore. But now, here it was, knocking at his door. At exactly 10 o'clock, Jonathan rose from his seat and made his way to Derek's office, his legs feeling like they were wading through molasses. Each step was deliberate, each breath a struggle against the tightness in his chest. He had been down this road before he knew what it felt like to be passed over for opportunities, to be dismissed without a second thought. But today, something about it felt different. He wasn't just another faceless employee. He wasn't going to let Derek Stone get away with whatever it was he had planned. Derek's office was located at the far end of the floor, tucked away from the rest of the department, a space that spoke volumes about his position, isolated, elevated, and untouched by the noise of the regular workforce. Jonathan knocked softly on the door, the sound sharp in the stillness of the hallway. "Come in," came the muffled voice from inside. Jonathan opened the door, and as he stepped inside, the familiar coldness of Derek's presence hit him like a wall. Derek was sitting behind his large, polished desk, his chair turned slightly toward the window, his back to Jonathan. It was a small power play, a subtle way of making Jonathan feel like he was the one who was out of place. But Jonathan wasn't going to be intimidated. Not today. Derek turned slowly in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he saw Jonathan standing there. "Jonathan," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something Jonathan couldn't quite place. "Thanks for coming in." Jonathan nodded, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "You said you wanted to meet." Derek leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling in front of his face, as if he were weighing something. "Yes, I did," he said, almost with a hint of amusement. "I've been thinking about your performance lately, Jonathan. You've been consistent, I'll give you that. But consistency doesn't always equal growth, does it?" Jonathan's stomach churned. He had heard these kinds of words before, spoken with the same polished tone. The corporate jargon that disguised the real message. "You're not good enough. You're not what we need." "I've been working hard," Jonathan said, trying to keep his voice calm, but it cracked slightly, betraying his unease. "I've been putting in the hours, taking on extra tasks. I've been doing everything I'm supposed to." Derek's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, you've done that, Jonathan. You've done exactly what's been expected of you." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But we're looking for more than just doing the minimum. We need someone who can take initiative, someone who can lead. And frankly, I don't think you're that person." Jonathan's chest tightened. He had expected this, but hearing it from Derek's lips felt like a punch to the gut. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against his ribs as he fought to keep his emotions in check. This wasn't just about a job. This was about everything he had worked for, the sacrifices he had made, the time he had spent away from his family, the constant feeling of never being enough. And, Derek continued, his eyes glinting with something darker, we've had some complaints about your interactions with other team members. I'm not saying it's anything serious, but let's just say there's been talk. Some people find you difficult to work with. The words hit Jonathan like a slap. Difficult to work with. He had spent years working tirelessly to get along with everyone, to be professional, to keep his head down. But he knew what this was. This wasn't about his work ethic or his ability to collaborate. This was about something else entirely. Is this about the diversity initiative? Jonathan asked, his voice steady but tinged with the bitterness he could no longer hide. Is this about the fact that I'm black? Derek's eyes flashed with a brief, almost imperceptible moment of defensiveness, but he quickly masked it with a forced chuckle. Jonathan, come on, don't be paranoid. It's not about that at all. This is about your fit with the team. We need someone who blends in, not someone who stands out. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. He had heard enough. The subtext of Derek's words was crystal clear now. It wasn't about his skills, his performance, or his potential. It was about the color of his skin and the unwritten, unspoken rules of an office that had always favored conformity over individuality. Derek's words had never been more transparent. Jonathan stood tall, his hands clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to lash out. I've worked here for 5 years. I've given everything to this company. And this is how you repay me? By telling me I'm not good enough because I don't fit in. You don't even know who I am, Derek. You don't know the sacrifices I've made just to be here. Derek looked at him with disdain, as if Jonathan were an inconvenience. I'm sorry you feel that way. But this is the reality. We're letting you go, effective immediately. Jonathan's world seemed to tilt. Let go. The words reverberated in his mind, but he couldn't quite process them. He had never thought it would come to this. He had heard rumors of other employees getting fired, of people being pushed out for reasons they couldn't understand. But he had never imagined he would be one of them. Are you serious? Jonathan's voice cracked, but he held his ground, refusing to let Derek see how deeply this cut. Derek gave a stiff nod. You'll get your severance. Pack up your things, and we'll make sure you leave in an orderly fashion. The words were final, delivered with a coldness that Jonathan would never forget. As he turned to leave Derek's office, his mind raced, his body frozen in disbelief. How could this be happening? How could the man who had worked so hard, who had faced every obstacle, be discarded so easily? But there was no time for answers now. The damage had been done. And as Jonathan walked out of the office, his heart heavy with the weight of injustice, one thing was clear: he wasn't leaving quietly. Not this time. Jonathan walked through the hallway, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and anger. His pulse raced, and his steps felt mechanical, as though he were on autopilot, his body moving without his consent. As he neared the elevator, his eyes were fixed on the ground, trying to block out the oppressive weight of what had just happened. Let go. The words replayed in his head like a broken record. The elevator dinged as the doors opened, and Jonathan stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, a sudden thought struck him. Something felt off. It wasn't just the sting of rejection. It was as if something had been set into motion that he couldn't yet understand. But before he could process it, the elevator came to a halt with a jarring thud. The lights flickered, and for a brief, unsettling moment, everything went silent. Jonathan frowned, pressing the button repeatedly in vain. The elevator wasn't moving, and the usual hum of the building had stopped. It was just him and the silence. His heart pounded louder in the stillness, and an uneasy feeling crept up his spine. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the elevator's speaker system, startling him. "Mr. Evans, can you hear me?" The voice was familiar, but Jonathan couldn't place it immediately. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice tight with both confusion and growing suspicion. The speaker clicked again. "It's Michael from the security desk. The elevator's stuck, but don't worry. We're working on it. Just stay calm." "Thanks," Jonathan muttered, trying to mask the irritation in his voice. He leaned back against the elevator wall, feeling a little too trapped in that confined space. But then, as the seconds ticked by, a strange thought crept into his mind. Why would Michael call me directly? Security was typically hands-off, and they wouldn't normally communicate like this unless something was off. Jonathan's instincts kicked in. Something didn't feel right. His eyes scanned the small steel-walled space, as though searching for answers, when suddenly the voice returned, sounding more urgent this time. "Mr. Evans, there's something you need to know. You're not just stuck in the elevator. There's been a mistake. A big one." Michael's voice was lower now, almost as if he was speaking in a code. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean? What mistake?" The voice hesitated, then dropped a bombshell. "It's Derek Stone. He didn't just fire you. He set you up. This wasn't just about your performance. You've been manipulated. You've been targeted. But you're not the only one." Jonathan stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. "What? What are you talking about? Why would he?" "Because he's been under investigation," Michael interrupted, his tone grave. "By a few people who've been watching him for months, including me." Jonathan's mind raced, trying to make sense of the revelation. Derek Stone, the man who had fired him so coldly, was under investigation. For what? And why was Michael someone from security telling him this now? "I don't have much time, but listen closely," Michael continued. "Derek's been running a series of shady deals through this company, using his position to exploit employees and cover his tracks. You were never supposed to get this far, Jonathan. But you've been doing too well, and it's made him nervous." The words hung in the air, and Jonathan's head spun. This wasn't just about a manager firing a loyal employee. This was about something much deeper, something far more sinister. His firing was a distraction, a tactic to get him out of the picture before he could uncover the truth. But what was Derek hiding? What had he done that made him so desperate to push Jonathan out? Michael's voice broke through Jonathan's thoughts, urgent now. "I need you to listen to me, Jonathan. Get out of the building. Don't go to HR. Don't trust anyone right now. They're all in on it. They're going to close ranks." Before Jonathan could respond, the elevator's lights flickered again, and Michael's voice cut off abruptly, leaving him in complete silence. Jonathan felt the panic rising in his chest, but he knew he had no time to waste. Michael's warning was clear. His life had just been turned upside down. But this was no longer just about a job, it was about survival. Derek had just unknowingly made a powerful enemy, and Jonathan wasn't about to let him get away with it. The elevator jolted back to life, and the doors opened with a soft hiss. Jonathan stepped out into the lobby, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. It wasn't just the loss of his job that hurt now, it was the realization that he had been a pawn in a much larger game. The rules had changed, and he had to play by a new set of rules. Jonathan stormed out of the elevator and into the lobby, his heart racing, his thoughts a blur. Every step felt like he was walking deeper into a trap, but he couldn't stop now. He had to find the truth, expose Derek Stone for the fraud he was, and make sure that no one else suffered the way he had. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out quickly, his breath catching in his throat when he saw the text. It was from Michael. "Get to the underground garage. I'll explain more. Hurry." Without a second thought, Jonathan headed for the building's parking garage. He moved quickly, his mind focused solely on the next steps, the next move. The shadows of the underground garage loomed ahead, the dim lights flickering above him as he descended the stairs. Every step felt like a countdown to something bigger, something far beyond what he'd imagined. When Jonathan reached the bottom, he scanned the area, his eyes darting between the empty vehicles and the shadows creeping along the walls. He saw no sign of Michael, but then a soft voice cut through the silence. "Jonathan, over here." Jonathan turned sharply to find Michael stepping out from behind a pillar, his face grim. He looked around cautiously, as if checking to make sure they weren't being watched. "What's going on?" Jonathan asked, his voice tight with urgency. "Why didn't you tell me everything earlier?" Michael glanced over his shoulder once more before leaning in, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Derek's been running an illegal operation, laundering money through company accounts, shifting funds to offshore accounts under different aliases. But he wasn't working alone. Some high-up investors are backing him. They knew you were getting too close, so they set you up. They knew if they fired you, you'd leave, but they didn't count on you pushing back." Jonathan felt a rush of adrenaline. This was bigger than he could have imagined. He had been a pawn, yes, but now he had a chance to be a kingmaker. A chance to bring it all crashing down. "You said they'd close ranks. What does that mean?" Jonathan asked, his pulse quickening. Michael's expression hardened. "It means, if you don't expose them now, they'll silence you permanently." Jonathan clenched his fists, the weight of the decision crushing him. He wasn't walking away anymore. This fight wasn't just for his job, it was for justice. And he wasn't going to lose. Not again. Jonathan knew there was no turning back now. He had a choice: keep running or make them run. With Michael's help, they'd gathered the evidence, everything they needed to expose Derek Stone and the corrupt network he was part of. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about standing up for what was right. For himself, for his family, for the people who had been crushed under Derek's boot, too afraid to speak up. The decision was made. The next morning, Jonathan walked into the office, head held high. He didn't have to say a word, his laptop was already in the hands of the authorities, the encrypted files full of damning evidence. Derek Stone was arrested within hours. The investors who had been backing his schemes scrambled to cover their tracks, but it was too late. The truth was out. Months later, Jonathan stood outside his new office, a small but growing consulting firm where he could finally rebuild. His old life felt like a distant memory. He wasn't just a victim of injustice, he was someone who had fought back, who had found his voice and used it. As he looked out over the city, Jonathan realized that sometimes the greatest battles are the ones you never see coming. But when you stand firm, when you fight for what's right, the world has a way of working itself out.